I have started out by lining the wolf with masking fluid on the outside edges, and then I filled the inside with frisket, which I do have a video I just made of this, and that will be live in a few weeks so you guys can see exactly how I make that happen. But the wolf is all taped off so that the airbrush that I'm using now won't accidentally get on the areas that I need to stay white. If that airbrush paint went over the wolf, I'm never going to be able to get his fur light enough again. If there's an area of your work that you need to stay light, you need to leave the paper showing through. You can lighten it up some, but you're never going to get it back to fully white. And being that this is a white wolf, that's a bit of an issue. So I don't want these dark brown colors over him. So I'm starting by airbrushing just very loosely. I'm being very, very messy, the trees in the background. And you can see I'm able to take that airbrush and go right over the wolf because he's completely taped off. And the nice thing about using the frisket and the masking fluid, neither one of them really removes much in the way of the graphite where I have previously drawn out all of his fur. So I'm still going to be able to see those lines once I remove that tape. With a heavier tape, sometimes that will remove the graphite, but these are so, especially the frisket, so low tack that that's not really an issue. So I just want to build up some atmosphere for the background with the trees. I'm not being exact. I'm not trying to get a ton of detail back there because I really want my wolf to be the focus. Plus, I'm going to come back over this with damask. I know you guys are shocked, but that will break some of this up anyway. So I don't need to put a ton of work and a ton of detail here. The colors that I'm using are a mixture of black and brown. The nice thing is, if you're hesitant to start using the airbrush, if you're just doing it for the backgrounds like this, you do not have to be good at all. It is so easy to get a really blurry, soft, out of focus look. It's a lot harder when you start trying to get all of your fine details in with the airbrush, but if you're just doing these out of focus looks, it's something that your first time through you're going to be able to do. You don't have to have tons and tons of practice for this. Of course, tons of practice helps, but it is something that right away you'll be able to accomplish. So I've added black to my mixture to darken it up even more. And when I use the mixture with the paints like this, I'm using Createx, which is an airbrush paint, but it's very, very thick. So what I do is use a spray bottle to spray water into my airbrush itself, into the gun, and then I put a few drops of the paint and use another clean paintbrush to kind of stir them together. And that way I get a much thinner consistency for the paint. It's more like the consistency of milk. I don't want it super thick or it'll just clog the airbrush. As long as I thin it out like this, especially it seems to be helpful if I put water first and then the paint. If I put paint first, the paint being so thick will draw down to where the needle is and it causes clogging. But if I've got water in there first, I don't really have a huge problem with clogging since I've switched to that order of loading the gun. Now I'm going to switch to white paint. So I've had to take water and run that through my gun to get rid of most of the black and the brown colors that were in there. I don't have to have it perfectly clean, but I do need most of that out so that my white is light enough. And the white is actually white with a little bit of brown because I don't want stark white here. I just want to be able to lighten some of this up. And when I mix my colors, I generally mix it right in the gun. In this case, I put water first, and then I put quite a bit of white, and then added 1 or 2 drops of brown on top so that I just tinted the white a little bit. But you don't have to mix it in a separate container. I like to keep things as simple and easy as possible so I can spend more time actually painting. Now it looks like I'm coming at this at an angle where I'm holding my brush to the side. I'm not. It's just the way that the camera is. You want to hold your airbrush to where you're aiming straight on at the photo or the piece that you're working on. You don't want to move the brush side to side in weird angles or you get effects that are not ideal. Now if I'm just misting water to keep paint wet, then I may do it side to side, but here you want to be straight on. So now I am using the white again with that mixture of brown and just lightly going over that with the damask print. And I'm just lifting it up to make sure that I've got my damask light enough. It is better to go too light than to go too dark and not be able to fix it. So it just gives me a nice soft look. Now when I go onto the other side, I've got to line up my damask print with what I've already done. And I tape it to the image, and there you go. So I've got everything on there. Now I'm peeling off the frisket. And now I am rubbing the masking fluid, just pulling that right off. You can see I've got that nice crisp edge. If it doesn't pull off easily, you can just rub it off with your finger, which is what I'm doing there. The portions that are airbrushed are not going to get messed up, so I can rub my hand all over it and nothing's going to rub off or get messed up. Now I am starting on the wolf. I am starting in colored pencil and I am working on his nose first. I like to get some of my darker areas done first. Now, one of the things that you don't see in this video is I actually went through the damask background and cleaned up my edges a bit with colored pencil. It's no fancy special technique. I just filled them in so that they were sharper because it was a bit fuzzier than I wanted. So I'm getting some of these darks in now, and it will help me to better judge the values in his fur. That's one of the problems that I have anyway with doing white fur is just, or anything that's pale, judging my values. So if I can get some of these darks in first, it makes it so much easier for me to be able to tell if I'm too light or too dark when I start in the fur itself. Normally, I like to start with whatever is furthest to the left of the paper, being that I'm right-handed, and work my way over. But in this case, I went ahead and started with the opposite side just so that I could easily get the darks in now. You can see that the areas of the nose that are dark, I've burnished. I've put that pencil in really heavy, but everywhere else that I know is not going to be black, I've gone in pretty light. So I'm just blocking in where my lights and my darks are going to go. And I'm doing that with my black pencil, even though I'm going to layer other colors over that. I believe the color that I'm using here is the lavender gray or violet gray. I use that pencil all the time. There hasn't been a single piece that I've used since I've gotten those Luminance pencils that I have not used that violet gray on. I love that color. Adding a touch of ultramarine blue, at least I think that's what that pencil was. And now some of the purple. Now, don't worry so much about your colors being exact, the same color I'm using, the same every time. The colors don't matter. Your values matter, how light or how dark you are in your colors. I use a lot of colors because I love them and I have them, so I may as well use them. But if you have a smaller set, you can get a look that's almost exactly like mine just by making sure that your values are correct. And by values, I mean how light or how dark something is. The color itself is not nearly as important. You can see I'm layering that purple right over the black that I've done. I generally don't leave any area that I've used straight black on a piece. I don't leave it flat black. I will put other colors over it so that it has a little bit more depth. A lot of artists don't like to use black at all. I have no problem with black, but I do generally put other colors over it so that it isn't flat. Now I'm using paint thinner on a Filbert Taklon bristled brush. I'm smoothing that out. I'm taking my purple tone. This is a very muted purple. It's not one of the bright violet colors. That's one of the things that I like so much about the Luminance set. It has so many very natural colors that aren't bright fluorescent and going to get out of control. When working on the nose, I think, well, really with working on most of it, but I try to think of everything as more of just random abstract shapes. Don't look at it as a nose and try to complete the nose, because if you do, chances are you're going to miss some of those shapes and it's not going to look right in the end. If you can teach yourself to look at it more abstract and just copy the shapes that are in the reference photo, you'll end up with a much more accurate, much more realistic look. If you're instead thinking, this is how in my head a dog nose looks, so this is how I'm going to do it, it's not going to come out right. One trick that a lot of artists use is to work upside down. This forces you to see things as shapes instead of a nose in this case. And that can help you to be a lot more accurate. If you've never tried that method, give it a try. You will be surprised at how much more accurate your work ends up coming out. That can be everything from drawing your initial line drawing to shading and blending. Now, anywhere in the piece that I'm going to want to stay really pale, very, very light, I take my white Luminance pencil and put that down first. Now, I will put other colors over it because very little of this stays white, but it helps protect that paper from getting too dark. Now here I'm using the white Luminance pencil to burnish a bit to pull out some of those highlights on the nose. Now if you're not familiar with what burnishing is, I do have a video on that. If you do a search on YouTube for Lacree, I think just Lacree and blending will pull up the video for the basics to blending colored pencil. It'll talk about the difference between burnishing and blending with paint thinner. I'd say that I'd put a link in the video description, but I always say that and I always forget to do it. Now here you can see I'm using the white pencil, and I get a lot of questions about this. People saying that their white pencil isn't getting things light enough. The white pencil isn't going to make things white again. If you want something to be white, you have to leave the paper white. In this case, I'm just lightening things up. Now here, I like my black Polychromos the best for these fine details because it just gets so much sharp detail. You can get that pencil so sharp, and you can get the Luminance very sharp too. But that black, or the Polychromos, they get to such a sharper point and they hold that point longer because they are a harder lead. So when I'm doing teeny tiny detail like this, that's where I like to switch to my Polychromos. Now the nose, or really any area, may not seem that important to you. A lot of people will be drawn to the eye. They think the eye is the main thing. And while it is going to be your focus in most cases, if you skip out or rush over an area like the nose or the dog's lips, that will really, really pull down the overall quality of your piece. The eyes are usually the easiest part. So make sure you put as much time needed into every little detail. Now notice that around the nose, you end up with this dark shadowed area that comes down to the lips and kind of outlines the nose. It's not the nose itself, but where the pigment of the skin underneath is showing through. So don't skip out on that. And that's the area that I'm working on right now. Around the mouth, I don't believe I'm actually using black here. I'm nearly positive that is a slate gray of some sort. I'm filling the tooth in with white so that if I do go too dark, I'm easily able to lift off any color that gets on the tooth. I'm adding the white around the edge that I know needs to stay white. The fine detail, I've switched back to my black Polychromos. Now, if you're getting a lot of sketchy lines that you're having a hard time getting rid of, one of two things can be happening. One, if you just switch to working in smaller circles, that will help you get those filled in more solid. The other is just keep layering and overlapping until you get rid of those. But I generally am working in small circles. It looks like I'm doing heavy, big, long brush strokes because the pencil, it's moving so quickly, but really it's smaller, more ovals and circles. And I overlap and overlap and overlap until I'm certain that I've got a nice, solid, even coverage. This is especially important if you're doing skin or something like that. You don't want areas that are much darker than others where it's not supposed to be. Using that violet gray again around the mouth. You can see that around the edge of the fur there, I've pulled that black up into the fur so I get that more sketchy, hairy look. It works better to do it that way than to try to pull the white over the black. Blending that out with paint thinner, again with a Taklon bristled brush. And the brushes that you're using for this don't matter at all. I like the Taklon bristled brushes because I like how soft they are. They're not too soft, not too hard. But as far as the brand that you're using, you can use the cheapest, most generic brush ever, and it will work just as good as the more expensive brushes for this. This is not an area that I would suggest spending lots and lots of money on. You spent enough on the pencils. Save your money on the brushes. Pulling that gray into the black. The black isn't solid black everywhere. There are a lot of highlights that go within the roof of the mouth that kind of show through. They're subtle, but they're there. By building slowly and the fact that I didn't go too dark too early on, I'm able to just keep building and building and building until I get this to where I want. Had I gone too dark too early on, this would be a lot more difficult to do. The one thing I do recommend is an ink eraser made by Faber-Castell. Those things are great for colored pencil because you're able to lift enough of it off that you're able to get more layers then, assuming you haven't damaged your paper underneath. Well, this is exciting. Where did I go? There I am, and I stopped. Okay, so now working into the fur around the face. Now I break this off into fairly small chunks. At this point I'm just working on the muzzle, and I'm throwing in the lights and the darks, where approximately those are going to go. I've shaded everything in here with the white Luminance pencil so that I don't go too dark, and if I do go too dark I can lift some of that color off and the white underneath will have protected the paper, to an extent anyway. Now you're going to hear me say this several times throughout the video, but as I'm working on the fur, I'm going for close. My fur is always going in the right direction. That is important. But as far as every strand of fur being in the exact right place, I think it's a bit of a waste of time. It doesn't really matter. As long as I've got clumps approximately where they're supposed to go and fur going in the right direction, that's what's going to create that realistic look for me. I'm not trying to get every single strand in the exact right spot because no one's going to know the difference. So why would I waste too much time doing that when I can be looser with that and still get the same end texture or feel, I should say. I love what Jason Morgan said recently. He backs up away from his painting. He said if he is standing at a distance and he can't see that detail from that far on, he doesn't need more detail. That is not an exact quote, but that was essentially what he was getting at. While I love detail, sometimes putting detail for the sake of detail is unnecessary because no one's going to know the difference. So here, I'm going for making sure that the fur is going in the right direction. I've got my shadows and highlights where they go, but each individual strand, not a huge deal. Now, one of the things that I do when I'm deciding which color to use, I don't always follow the color in the reference photo exact, but if I'm having a hard time thinking, is this a cool gray or is this a warm gray? I use Photoshop with an eyedropper tool to determine if that's a warm or a cool gray, because sometimes depending on what color that gray is up against, it's really hard to tell. So if you can use Photoshop and an eyedropper tool, that really makes things easy. And I have a video showing you guys how to do that. I don't even remember what it's called, so that's not helpful at all. Okay, stopped being lazy and I looked it up. If you do a search on YouTube for Lacree and how I choose the right color, it'll pull up that vlog. And the scratching sound that you're hearing, my hermit crab is way too energetic right now, and unfortunately that tank is on my desk. We will be moving in a few months and you guys won't have to listen to that anymore. He will be in another room. So I used paint thinner there to smooth everything out. I'm not even close to being done with the muzzle there. That was just kind of a base coat. Moving on to the lips. I'm getting my darkest areas in there first with the black. Again here, even though the fur is very, very short, there is fur around a lot of this area. Well, right there, actually the lips. But when I move down, is a lot of fur here. And so here, again, I've got to pay very close attention to which direction my pencil is moving in so that I'm capturing the movement of that fur. If I'm putting random spots or random lines all over the place just because I can see in the photo there's detail, but it's not correct detail, then I'm wasting my time and making it look worse. So you really want to watch that on your reference photo. Which direction is that fur going? And here, because that fur is so short, my brush strokes or I say brush strokes, my pencil strokes are just shorter. Using that violet gray for the base there. Actually, that one may not be the violet gray. It looks a little bit more purpley. Helpful, aren't I? Just put colors on the paper. You're good. Best teacher ever. So you can see I'm keeping those areas around the lips very, very light. They're way too light right now, but I would rather be too light than too dark. I can go back and darken that up, no problem. You can see these little splashes of that burgundy color. They're very, very, I've used it, yeah, I can't talk. I've used it sparingly, but it's still important that they be in there. Each of these little lines all adds up to the finished piece looking realistic. So much of this seems unimportant, but it all adds up to one big effect. So around my edges here, I've chosen a grayish tone. It's a warm gray that is very similar to my background. And that way I can pull some of that background into the wolf and get me that sketchy look. That was great English there. Get that sketchy look that gives me the fuzzy look, makes his chin look furry. So I can pull the background color into the wolf itself. And I do that a lot, whether it be on my owls or anything else. When I've got an airbrushed background, I can find a color that's very similar to the background, work right over the background itself and into the wolf to get me a more refined outer edge. That's one of the things that I like about having such a large set of colors. I'm almost guaranteed to have a pencil that will match perfectly with whatever background that I have. If I don't, I can just mix it. Finally, moving on to the eye. I'm outlining that with my Polychromos black. Now notice that curve, that inside section of the eye, it's not a flat line, it's very rounded, and that's important in making sure that the eye itself looks three-dimensional and rounded. If I put a straight or just diagonal line in there, if I wasn't paying attention to the reference photo, if that's not curved, it's not going to look three-dimensional in the end piece. The biggest way that you can improve your artwork is to pay attention to your reference photos. Learn to see things as they are, not how you think they are. Really pay attention to each one of those little details. You can see as I'm working around on the fur here, it changes direction constantly. You've got to pay attention to that. It's easy to start getting lazy and get into a movement that you just repeat over and over and over again, but you end up making the fur go in the wrong direction all over the place. So you'll see that I stop and pause all the time. And this video is sped up about 2.5 times, so you don't see the pauses as long, but I stop and pause constantly to look at that reference photo. I probably spend more time looking at the reference photo than I do actually making marks on my paper. And don't feel like you have to rush through this. If you work slow, that is totally okay. So I'm blending that out again with the paint thinner. All of the brushes that you'll see me use on this are all Taklon bristled brushes. Some are filberts and some are flats. Most of them are filberts, meaning the brush tip is slightly rounded. So I wanted to pull out a little bit more detail on top of the black. So there I had used the masking tape and a really sharp pencil to push on the wolf's mouth, and I was able to lift off some of the black that pulled out some of those little dots that I was looking for around the lips. You can see that sharp pencil is really, really sharp to get the fine detail in there. And that one was not black. It was one of my darker warm grays. Pulling out some of the whiskers with white. Now it looks like that is a really dull pencil. It's not. It's just been sharpened on the edge with sandpaper. So while there's not a lot of lead showing, the lead that is there at the tip was very sharp. That way I could get those fine lines for those whiskers. Still going back and building up on that nose. And throughout this piece, later on I'll be working on the fur and I will still notice something different that I want to adjust on the nose. So I jump around a lot as I work. Now I'm making those tiny, tiny little marks for the little hairs on the chin. Very, very short, quick strokes there. They're almost dots. A little bit longer than dots, but very, very short. And that gives the illusion that the hair is aiming at you. So not only is the fur short there, some of it is angling straight at you. So those little dots help create that look. The colors that I used on this will be listed below in the description. It is mostly a combination of warm and cool brown, or grays. Now the chin here is actually a lot lighter than it's going to need to go. All of the muzzle is. Once I got the rest of the fur in, it was easy for me to tell that I needed to darken everything up by quite a bit. And this is one of the reasons that I jump around so much, because sometimes it's so hard to tell if you're dark enough until you get the fur around that area blocked in. And I hear from people a lot that they have a hard time doing white fur, completing white fur or black fur. And I actually have a black panther that I'm planning for a few weeks away from now. But for the white fur, very little of it stays very, very white, only your highlights. And on this guy, because he's backlit, the outside edges will stay white. But for the most part, the rest of the hair are just varying shades of gray and tan. And I think I have a little bit of that kind of soft, what is the word I'm looking for? As an artist, you would think I would know colors. It's kind of a rosy color. Both Polychromos and Luminance make that color. To it, I can't tell you what it is, but it will be listed in the video description. But the colors in the fur, when you're doing white, are going to be dependent on what colors are in your background. If you've got a lot of blue in your sky or a dark blue, all of that, you're going to switch from so much of the grays into those blues. The white is so reflective of those things. Here, I am mostly grays and browns, and so that's really what is going to reflect in my wolf's coat. And really, anything that you're doing, no matter the color of your subject, you want to pull some of those background colors into its fur, feather, skin, whatever it is. That makes them all feel like they're more a part of the same piece than if you've got totally different sets of color that you used on the subject and totally different sets of colors that you used on your background. Make sure that you're mixing those together, but it is going to be most obvious on white furred animals. If you look at my reference photo, and this reference photo is from wildlifereferencephotos.com, so you can purchase this yourself if you want to paint this wolf. But if this guy, he didn't have this much brown in him. I did that so that he worked with my background. If I had a lot of green in the background, I would actually pull some of that green into his fur. I mean, you don't want to go crazy with that green, but you still would pull some of that into it. When I'm working on my base layers with the fur here, and I call it my base layers because I'm going to have to come back through and darken all of this up later, but the thing that I am most concerned about is the direction of the fur. That matters more than anything else, both the direction of the fur and the length of each pencil stroke. It might seem crazy to use that rose color I was just using, but when it builds up with the rest of the grays, it gives you a very nice look that builds more depth in your subject. Not because it's rose, but just because it's another color. For the eye, I'm using this reddish brown color. And then I'm taking that pale blue for where the reflection is on the eye. And my violet gray that I so love. Better defining that outer edge now. Again, I went with the Polychromos black here just so that I could get such fine detail. I believe that's an ultramarine blue that I'm using there. I didn't use a ton of blue on this piece, just a little bit, because there's no blue in my background. Like I said earlier, had blue been in my background, that blue would be all over the wolf. Blending that out with paint thinner. Now that again is a Taklon bristled brush, but it's a round brush, so I can get the finer detail. With those, what I actually do is just get a cheap set that gives you multiple brushes with that type of bristle. So if you're working on small areas, you can switch to a smaller brush. And I disappeared again. I'm using a deeper blue on top of some of the light blue and then defining where that pupil would be. Notice the upper section of the eye is slightly darker than the bottom section. Actually, it's quite a bit darker. Pulling out the highlight a bit better. Now you want to be careful with your highlight. You don't want to put it over the entire eyeball or you will make it look like he has cataracts. So watch that when you're doing the highlights on the eyes. I know it's a lot of fun to put that shine, and sometimes even on your reference photo, you'll have a shine that covers the majority of the eye. But be careful of that because most people will look at your painting and drawing and think that you did it wrong. Using the violet gray to do some of the shading around the eye there. I'm going on top. I'm actually burnishing with the white right now to make sure that that white is really, really in there because that whole outer edge needs to stay very light. I'm using that gray tone that matches my background to pull some of the background into the fur to better define that. Just getting the subtle shadows around the eye. Now, you don't have to jump around as much as I do. If you are comfortable working on a tiny, tiny area at a time until it's completely finished, that is totally fine. It just depends on what you're comfortable doing. I know I jump around a lot more than most people. And it isn't an issue of one way being better than the other for everybody. It's an issue of which way works best for you. So here I'm being very loose. I'm blocking in the main dark areas for the face, or the cheek, I guess. If you're not already in the habit of doing so, keep a scratch piece of paper that is the same kind of paper that you're working on next to your project. That way you can test colors in different orders and layers to see what effect you get. Because sometimes if you put a blue down first and then the red on top, it'll be totally different than if you put red down and then blue on top of that. So it's nice if you have a scratch piece of paper next to you that you can test all of these out on. Again, the direction of the fur, very important there. Tiny hermit crab, you are making too much noise. Please stop. The paper that you see off to the side that my hand is resting on is glassine. This is an acid-free, fairly translucent paper that you can get in rolls, and it is so great for protecting your work. I had used tracing paper forever, and tracing paper works, but it can pick up some of the colored pencil and it can cause a little bit of smudging if you're not careful. Not a huge deal. I found that to be more of an issue when I was working on Stonehenge. That paper seems to smudge really easily. But with the glassine, this is the best thing for preventing that. because nothing really sticks to it. It has a sort of waxy feel to it. The paper that I am working on here is the Fabriano Artistico Extra White Hot Pressed 140-pound watercolor paper. I think the Stonehenge is going to be my favorite for portraits, but for everything else, I really do like the Fabriano. It's easier to get the fine detail. And if you're trying to decide between the two, honestly, they're similar enough that if you haven't spent thousands of hours working in colored pencil, you might not notice the difference so severely. For me, when I did the damask print on the Stonehenge, I noticed a big difference in how it was more difficult for me to get those sharp edges, and it did smudge very easily. But the Fabriano did not do that. I also find that the Fabriano doesn't warp as much when I add the airbrushing. It can handle the masking fluid a lot better as well. Now, the Stonehenge will go back into shape if you wet it and dry it again, but as long as the edges were taped down. So I'm blending that out with paint thinner. You can see I've layered several colors. I've got that rose tone on top of a lot of these grays. Now, most of what I have here isn't even going to show in the end result, but look how dark that muzzle is. This is a white wolf, and look how dark I had to go to get to the end result that I wanted. It is a lot darker than most people are expecting. People will try to do these white wolves or white animals, and they leave everything way too light. White is very, very rarely white. Start noticing, look around your house at things that you expect to be white, like a paper towel, or I'm looking at stuff on my desk, the lid to my water bottle, but they're never actually white unless very, very harsh light is hitting it. So I'm using the Scotch Magic tape again with a very sharp pencil to pull out a few highlights there. I don't have my darks dark enough that this really showed up that well, so I didn't end up using this technique for very much of the wolf. But I was able to lighten things up enough this way that I came back through with a white colored pencil, and that pulled everything out. See here where I did it over the mouth where I was over a darker area? That really worked a lot better and made it much harsher. But over the light areas, I found that it didn't stand out enough that it was the best method for me to use. That Scotch Magic tape trick would work great if you were doing grass where you've got those darker colors. Then those blades of grass will show up really well with that tape. I have a video showing you guys how to use that too, if that didn't show you enough here. If you do a search on YouTube for Lacree and I believe just magic tape, it should come up. So I'm being very sketchy here so that it looks like I've got fur. Now, a lot of times I'll go a little bit harsher on my sketchy lines than I need to be because I'm going to layer colors on top of that, and I want those lines to show up. So by going harsh now, when I blend colors over it, some of these lines still show through. They'll be subtle, but they'll still show. If I don't go too harsh, they won't show when I layer other colors on top. And the area that I have on the face, while it looks really dark right now, it's still not dark enough. I'm going to come through and darken all of this up again later. So again, back to white is rarely really white. And if you're having a hard time rendering white animals, that's probably the problem. You're probably keeping everything too light. You can see I've taken that purple color and I went around my edge between the white and the black. I'm not leaving everything totally harsh. This gives me a more natural fade between the black area and the white area. That sort of little detail makes a big difference in the end, even though it's not that noticeable right on and all on its own. I layered purple, a deeper purple, over the black in the eye, again to create more depth so that I don't have just flat black. What I like to do to keep it from getting overwhelming, even though I skip around a bunch and I will come back and rework different areas, I try to focus on one general area here. I just focused on the muzzle for an entire night. I mean, that's all I worked on, or maybe a night and a half, I don't know. But I worked on just that before I moved on to the rest of the fur. Knowing I'd still come back and do touch-ups, I still want to get it done as much as possible now so that it doesn't get overwhelming. If you try doing all of the fur, if I was doing this area and the ear and the neck, it would get very overwhelming and a bit frustrating because all of it would look kind of bad at the same time. If I can get some of the areas looking pretty good or close to finish, it makes it easier for me to not get frustrated and think, oh, this whole thing looks terrible, I just want to throw it away. I've got some areas here, like the lips and the nose are pretty much completely done. There's very little else that needs to be done on those. So, and the eye as well. So it makes it easier for me to see, okay, this is looking good. I don't need to throw it away and start over again. Because technically these base layers, I could do the base layers on the entire wolf all in one shot. My end result would be the same, but it makes it a little bit more frustrating, I guess. There's a better word there. I'm just not thinking of it. It is too early, but it makes it a little bit harder to move on and not get frustrated that your whole piece looks terrible right now. Because we sure go through some ugly stages when we're layering this way. So I am going to skip over to the ear so that I can better judge the values of the fur that are next or to the right of the ear. So I'm blocking in some of my darker areas first. And you can see the areas under the eye, that cheek area, none of that is finished. Right now, it looks like a 5-year-old with a crayon got a hold of my piece. But I've blocked in the general lights and darks there. So I know I will have to go back and do a lot more work there, but I was having a hard time judging my values, so I needed to get some of the dark areas around it, which is what working on the ear is going to do for me. I'm using a pencil that is very similar to my background color so that I can refine those edges of fur. Now the inside of the ear is an area I see a lot of people skip out on when they're drawing pets. It is so important. There is so much that goes on inside an ear, and I think that the fluffier ears are easier to do than the ears like on an Italian Greyhound that has so many ridges and so many folds, but you still want to pay attention to all those little details. Skipping out here really will pull down the entire piece. In this case, just like everywhere else, I've got to pay close attention to the direction of my fur, which areas are very, very soft and smooth, and which areas are fluffy. You can see there I'm working in small circles and overlapping so that I get that smooth transition from one area to another. None of these lines or sections and clumps of fur right now that I'm doing are random. I'm really watching my reference photo here. A lot of these details, if you're having a hard time noticing them on your reference photo, a lot of this just comes with time and teaching your brain to look for them. Even just looking back 5 years ago at what I was completing, I was working on realistic pet portraits, but I still didn't notice the things that I notice now. You just get to where your brain starts to recognize things that it didn't used to see. So if you're looking at something and you're comparing yourself with other artists and thinking, oh, mine doesn't look like that, I can't get mine to do that, you will eventually if you stick to it. Blending that out with the paint thinner. Now through this entire piece, because I'm not trying to get a smooth look like I would with skin, I've got a lot of paint thinner on that brush. I did not have to be careful. And I wasn't really worried about blending one section into the other because I did want a softer look. So I didn't have to be as careful as I normally am. And that's one thing that I notice when I do fur and feathers. I don't have to be very careful. I can use tons of paint thinner and just slop it all over the place. When working on skin, I have to be much more precise about how much paint thinner I have on the brush at various layers. But fur and feathers are much, much more forgiving. Now I'm using such a dark color, I have to make sure that the areas that I put this in really do need to be dark. It's always better to go too light than to go too dark early on. It's so easy to darken stuff up. Not so much when it comes to lightening things up. You can make things more pale easily, but you can't make them get the paper back to completely white so easily, if at all. Now areas that I want the fur to look really, really soft, I'm not going to put as many pencil lines in. I'm going to do more of the little circles and get it much smoother. The more lines that you put in fur or hair, if you're doing people, the more lines are going to make it look more wiry or rougher. Where I want things to be very, very soft, I'm going to have smoother transitions between my colors, not sketchy lines. So here with the ear, there's a lot of really soft fur in there, so you're not going to see as many lines as you did around the muzzle. You can see I'm being very messy with this. I'm letting the black blend right into the grays and pink colors that I have on there. And I'm gone again. Not much is more exciting than watching nothing happen on a video, huh? Now that ear is not anywhere near finished, but I've got my values in so that I can better judge the fur around it. So now I can go ahead and move on. I've taken this grayish, this warm gray color, and I've sketched in the rest of the fur. Or at least the major clumps of the fur, so that I can keep track of which direction everything is going in. If I took the time to draw it out, I don't want to lose it while I'm blending, so I'm going to go ahead and sketch that in everywhere now. I'm being fairly loose with this. I don't care if it's exact. I just need to make sure that the strokes of fur are going in pretty much the right direction. And now I'm working off camera. I'm really good at this, huh? Let's go ahead and edit that section out. Now I'm back up to working on finer detail on the muzzle again, darkening things up. And I do recommend, if you're not already doing this, take photos of your work on your cell phone and look at it smaller. It makes it so easy to judge if something is too dark or not dark enough, much more so than just even stepping back. Something about seeing it on the screen, if you can get an accurate photo of it anyway. If you've got a flash going off or something like that that distorts it, that's not going to help you. But if you can get a decent photo of it, it really will help you when you see it shrunk down on your screen, to know or notice things that need to be lighter or darker. Throwing in some of those whiskers now. Now in this case, some of those whiskers layered into the black of the inside of the mouth. I didn't need to leave the paper white there because I don't want that to be perfectly white. I just want to hint that the whisker is layering over that. If that was white, it would stand out way too much against the dark. And the more that I build up, the more that I can see how much darker I need to go in a lot of these areas. Oh good, I left again. I've got to start pausing that video camera before I take off. Moving my glassine over to protect some of the fur on the face now. Now I find that it's not as big of a deal if I'm just working with one of the wax-based pencils. It doesn't smudge as much, but with the oil base I end up getting a lot of that on the side of my hand if I'm not protecting the paper. Plus you really don't want the oils from your hand on the paper because it can lessen the archival qualities because of the acid in our hands. So it's always a good idea to keep paper underneath your work. Or under your hand. Whatever, you know what I mean. I hope. If all of the colors that I'm using seem a little bit intimidating, you don't know what color to put where, like I said before, it's not that big of a deal anyway, but use less colors then. Make it simple on yourself and really focus on those values. You don't have to put all of the blue tones that I was using in here. You can really get away with having a very nice, very realistic looking wolf, probably using half the colors that I used. And the more that you work and the more that you complete things, the easier it will get for you to decide which colors will look good where. Using the white pencil to pull out strokes of hair over the dark areas. Now, the dark areas on there, because they've all been blended with paint thinner, none of that really was burnished. So when I come back through with the white pencil, it shows up very, very well. It's not completely white, but you can see those individual strokes of hair that I created with the white pencil. Had I burnished that area where the paper was very flat, then it wouldn't take the white very well. So knowing when it's safe to burnish and when you need to make sure that you're using lighter layers and keeping your paper's tooth on there is important. But that too comes with practice. So you can see that white pencil, while not white, it is showing up quite nicely, which is perfect for the look that I want here because that is falling within a shadow. I don't want that fur to be white. If I needed it to be really white, I would actually take the ink eraser and erase some of the colored pencil as much as possible and then put the white on top of it to lighten it up even more. But even that, with as dark as I've got the inside of the ear, I would never get anything in there completely white again. So as you're working, you really want to plan out what goes where. You don't want to be as messy as you are with painting. With painting in acrylics or oil, it's a lot more forgiving because of the way that you can layer. You just, like here, if I needed something inside that ear to be really white, I would just put opaque white paint over it. With colored pencil, you can't do that. You need to do a little bit more planning with colored pencil. The bonus here is that you're not fighting a dry time, so you have plenty of time to plan things out, what needs to go where. Pretty sure that wasn't a complete sentence at all. The other thing, when I want my first strokes over the dark areas to really stand out, I want my pencil to be very, very sharp. It's much easier to get those to stand out with a sharp point than it is with a duller tip on the pencil. And I can make some of these whiter areas stand out even more by taking a dark color going right up next to it. Just creating that contrast will make things pop. I'm using that pencil to create some texture of fur in there, but I don't want to go crazy because that is a very, very soft fur inside the ear. Too many brush strokes or pencil strokes in here will make it look wiry. Softening it out with paint thinner. The great thing with the paint thinner is, like I said earlier, you're not damaging the tooth of the paper, so I'm able to layer and then layer more and keep layering. If you burnish, that is not the case. So now that I've got more of the darks in on the ear, I can again go back through to the fur around that and judge my values better. I find this to be a bigger deal when working on lighter colored subjects. It can get so hard to judge your values. So by jumping around like this, I do think it makes it a lot easier. If I were working on a leopard or a tiger, something with darker fur, it's not as hard for me to judge my values. It is as it is on something that's so light. I'm using that white over areas that I know I'm going to want to be able to have the control or the ability to come back and lighten up again later. Even though I'm going to put darks over it, by putting that white Luminance colored pencil down first, it will make it easier for me to lift any colored pencil back off the paper if I want it. If I'm doing white flowers, I do the same. I get the entire petal done with white and then put my darks over it. That way, if I need to lighten it back up, I easily can. If I put the darks straight onto the paper, I'm never going to lighten it up as much as I would if I had put white down first. Coming back through with that rose burgundy color. I should probably look up what the name of that pencil is. And I left again. Okay, I stopped being lazy. I went and grabbed the pencils that I keep talking about as being a rose color. In Polychromos, it's called caput mortuum. I can't say that. I'll write it. It'll be that listed in the video description. And then for the Luminance, it is burnt sienna 50%. Luminance, I like your names better. They're easier to say. But both those colors are almost exactly the same. And that's that rosy color that I'm getting all over the wolf. And I work upright, so I just use a bit of masking tape to tape that glassine to my board. The masking tape is not touching my actual project though. If you get masking tape on an area that you're working on, it will pull off the colored pencil from the paper. So make sure that if you do tape the glassine down like I am, you're taping it to the board around it, not to the actual project. I am layering this pale, cool gray over all of this, and you can still see those sharper brush strokes, or pencil strokes. I keep saying brush strokes. Those sharper pencil strokes under it. So I still have that look of fur, but it softens it up quite a bit. It's almost like what glazing would do in painting. I'm using a very light hand as I apply these layers right now over that because I do want those darker strokes to show through. I just want them to be more subtle. Adding the white again on areas that I want the ability to come back through and lighten up quite a bit. Now here, I'm not working in small circles. This I don't need to. I can be very messy as long as my pencil strokes are going in the direction of the fur. On a person, if I was doing skin, I would need to stick with those small circles to keep it very smooth. But on the fur, as long as I'm going in the right direction, I can be very sloppy. Coming back through with the shadows, I believe that is my violet gray again. Now here's where I'm starting to break down and really pay attention to the direction of the fur in the coat here, because it twists and turns in all kinds of crazy directions. But having that fur go in the proper direction is what determines the muscular structure underneath that coat. Softening that out with the paint thinner. And again, like I said earlier, I'm being messy. I'm going over my dark and my light areas. It just smudges them together nicely, which is a look that I want here. If I needed to keep my dark areas separate from my light areas, I would be cleaning my brush off in the paint thinner and wiping it off on the paper towel before I switch from the light to dark. For example, if I wanted to use this brush right now to blend out the white area on the very top of the wolf's head, I would rinse it in the paint thinner and then wipe it off on the paper towel before working on that area. Otherwise, I would drag some of the gray that I currently am doing, would get dragged right up into that white. And what this is doing, it's softening up a lot of the fur there too. Again, I don't want him to be too wiry. throughout this piece, every time I thought I had that chin dark enough, I would back up and look at it and realize I need to darken it up even more. It really was very, very dark. Now, if you are painting or drawing white animals, do get a good reference photo. If you're working with a reference photo where the shot was taken with a flash, it is going to white out the entire coat. I wouldn't even consider doing a pet portrait of a white pet. Well, I don't work off of them if it's a bad photo anyway, but if it was taken with a flash on a white pet, it's not even possible to see the detail that you need in the white coat. It just looks all white. And as you can see here, white should not be all white if you're going for that realistic look. So having a good photo where you can easily see your lights and your darks is so important in being able to render a realistic looking white animal. As I'm layering like this, I can add as many layers as I want, where I layer, add colored pencil, blend out with paint thinner, add more layers with colored pencil, blend out with paint thinner. You can repeat this so many times as long as you're not burnishing in between layers. Once you start burnishing and flattening out the paper, you're going to limit yourself. I have an artist friend who works in colored pencil, and she burnishes right from the beginning of all of her pieces, but she's got to make sure that every single color is the exact right color that she wants there, because she's not going to be able to layer over it. She gets beautiful results. It's just a completely different technique. To layer like this, you've got to protect your paper. Now, one thing that I found, depending on the paper that you're using, with this, I can blend out with paint thinner, and I can generally go over it with pencil right away without really damaging the paper. With softer paper like the Stonehenge, I have to make sure that anything that I've applied paint thinner to is completely dry before I touch that pencil to it again, or it can mess up the paper. I generally wait for everything to dry anyway, but it is something that you want to be aware of. The softer papers, that's a much bigger deal on. It should only take a few seconds to dry though, so it shouldn't be too hard for you to wait. Now those rose colors that I was using, that burnt sienna 50% and the word that I can't say on the Polychromos, those colors, you can see now how they're starting to work with the whole piece. Before they may have seemed way too pink, but as I start layering other colors in there, they start to really make a lot more sense. Now the way that I do fur like this, I will come back through and add white over a lot of this. But in order to do that, I've got to make sure everything's dark enough in the first place for the white to show up. Because I don't need the white to be completely white, I can layer like this where I get everything very dark and then put the white on top. Then again, like I've said so many times, if you need that white to be white, you need to leave the paper white so that it really stays that light. But here, coming through with the white pencil, that is very, very sharp. And I can start creating the texture of the fur. Now what I will do is add the white here, like this with the white pencil, and then I'm going to come through with some of the darks in between some of these brush strokes or pencil strokes to better define the clumps of fur. But for me, it's easier to do the white fur first, or on top like this of the darks, and then to come back and refine those little details with the darks. Now it'll start becoming more apparent. If you look at my reference photo, if you find that on wildlifereferencephotos.com, you will see each of these strokes is not exact. I'm not trying to make it super hyper realistic. I want it realistic. I want you to still feel like it's a wolf, but I'm not going to spend so much time making sure every single strand of fur is the exact same as in the photo, because the end result, I don't think it would really matter. This here, I'm going for the general feel. I'm making sure that the fur is going in the right direction, but each single strand is not exact to my photo. As long as I copy the length of the fur and the direction that it's moving, I will still get that very realistic look without spending too much time on every single strand. Plus, when you start putting in every single strand, it tends to start looking really wiry. What I did there, I was measuring to make sure which shadowed area I was working on. I knew that the shadow I wanted came straight across from the darkest portion of the ear. So I'm checking my work against itself to determine which clump of fur that I'm working on. This will help my work to be more accurate. I'm adding the white again to the areas that I need to stay very light, blending that out with paint thinner. You can see because I'm smudging the darks right into the lights, I do end up with a very smudged look, but that is what I want here, so I can be messy with that paint thinner. I'm refining those sketchy lines right there under the throat. Again, just following the direction of the fur, not worrying about every single stroke being the exact same as the photo. The main things that are exact are where my shadows fall. That is a big, big deal, much more so than each individual strand of fur. If those shadows are in the wrong place, it will distort the shape of the wolf. As I start to build up these darker shades on the face, the ear starts to make more sense. Before, it seemed so dark just floating there that everything looked wrong. But as I get all of these other values in there, everything starts to come together much more. So when you're looking at your piece, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, this looks terrible, I should just start over, don't. Continue to push forward on it, because they all go through some really ugly stages. When I'm doing each of these individual strands of fur, I need the tip of my pencil to be very, very sharp. So here, the pencil that I'm using right now doesn't look sharp, but it actually is. It's just that I filed it down with the sandpaper, so the tip of it is very sharp. But one thing that I see students do a lot that I think is, it makes it harder on them, is not keeping those pencils sharp. Remember, if your pencil sharpener is producing teeny little slivers of shavings, the blade is too dull. You'll want a new blade on that sharpener. A sharpener that has a good blade on it, a nice sharp blade, is going to produce very, very long shavings. That way you're not shredding your pencil. Now when I'm creating these strands of fur, I'm not holding the pencil down the whole time. I'm pushing hard at the beginning of the strand and I lift it as I get towards the end. And this is creating a thinner line at the end of each of those areas of fur. So I'm pushing hard, I lift it as I move back to the original location of where that fur started, and then another stroke. But I'm not scribbling back and forth where the pencil is touching the paper the entire time, if that makes any sense. You can see on the edge of that pencil where the dark brown kind of runs up the side of the wood. That's because of how I sharpened it on the sandpaper. Some of that color comes off on the side of that pencil. There you can see where the whole tip of that is all smudged. Now when you're doing the clumps of fur like this, you can see in the neck, I've got some very, very dark areas in there. And I have to make sure that I go back through and soften those up. Otherwise, it almost looks like tiger stripes, which is not the look that I want. I want shadows. So I need those shadows to be softer. So you'll see as I work, I'll go back through and soften those edges between the light and the dark. If those edges are too sharp, again, you end up with tiger stripes. Which would be kind of interesting, but not what I'm going for here. So I'm taking the white Luminance pencil and going over the back area here that I need to stay very, very light. And being messy, I don't care about working in small circles here. I'm essentially burnishing anyway, so I can be very, very messy as I apply that white pencil. Now this shadow that goes between that light area along the back of the neck down, I need that to be very soft, so I'm starting with that first. I want that transition to be very smooth. Then I'm going to come down and just fill a base dark coat on pretty much the entire neck. I'm focusing here on where my darks and lights need to go more so than the individual clumps of hair. And here I'm working in smaller circles, just so that it's nice and smooth. Working in those smaller circles, I don't really have to worry about the direction of the fur then, because I will put that on top. If I were being messy, I would, and leaving heavier strokes, I would need to pay close attention to which direction the fur was moving at that point, because those strokes may end up showing. Knowing when you can be lazy and messy versus when you want to work in those smaller circles will come with practice. Most of that there is that burnt sienna 50%. I'm now adding some of the brown over the rosy color and in between where the rose isn't. At this point, I just want to get all of the white on my paper completely covered. I'm doing this with a very light hand. Like I said earlier, if I end up burnishing it all, when I come back through with the white for doing the individual hairs with the white pencil, they won't show up. So I need to make sure that my paper is not damaged at all for this technique to work. Coming back through with the gray, more gray. This is one of the warmer Luminance gray pencils. I'm layering on top of that rose color. That burnt sienna 50%, I don't want that to be really, really pink. I just want that hint of red underneath the grays and browns. So layering other colors on top of it will help me to get the look that I'm going for. And if you don't have a scratch piece of paper off to the side where you can test that out, you wouldn't know that that's the order to get the color that you are wanting there. When you use a lighter hand, when you're blending one color into the next, you can get a softer transition. So if you're going for that really blurry background, layering it by doing these light layers will make it much easier to get that soft transition from one color to another than if you're pushing harder for each layer. Blending this first set of layers out with paint thinner now. Now you'll see me using several brushes for this. Honestly, on this one, other than the tiny areas where I used the smaller brush, it just had to do with which brush I grabbed first. I just wanted a filbert bristled, or a filbert shaped tackle-on bristled brush. But there was no more rhyme or reason to why I used the silver brush versus the black handled brush in this. Now you can see the areas where I had laid down really heavy white first. See how much they stand out now? When I went through and blended all of the colors that I layered on top of it with paint thinner, that white really pulls through. So it protects the paper where you want it to be white, even from the paint, colors that you've used paint thinner on over it. So I've let that dry, and now I'm going to start building up more of the dark areas of the fur. Here, again, I'm back to paying attention to which direction that fur moves. That is the ink eraser I was talking about. This one of my YouTube viewers sends them to me from Mexico. They're much more inexpensive and they don't have the little brush on the end. The ones that are sold here in the US, instead of being that lime green, the paint on the outside casing of the pencil or eraser is a cream color, and then it has a little brush on the end for erasing your pencil or eraser shavings or crumbs, whatever you want to call them, but it costs a little bit more. So they both do the same thing. The actual eraser itself is the same, but the nice thing with those erasers is that it will lift so much more colored pencil than any other eraser, being that it is an ink eraser. You do want to watch though, if you're using really thin, cheap paper, that eraser could start to damage your paper. But on the thicker, heavier watercolored paper that I use, it's not a problem. And anytime you see me with a bright lime green pencil, that's what I'm using, is the Faber-Castell's ink eraser. You can see I'm better refining the shape of each of these clumps at first. So you'll see I'll kind of come back through at a diagonal and break one of them up so that I'm creating smaller clumps instead of the large clumps that I started out with. Again, breaking up some of those bigger chunks into smaller little clumps. Just like the rest of the fur, you have to pay attention to which direction those clumps are moving in. For me, I have an easel that sits on my table because of my back. I have to work upright, but it's sitting up on an easel almost at a 90-degree angle, and I have this rubbery mat thing. It's actually a shelf liner that I got at Walmart, just a roll of this rubbery stuff. I keep that underneath my tabletop easel, and my pencils sit on top of it, and this works out so good because my pencils are all spread out right in front of me, whichever ones that I'm using, and they don't roll away so easily because of that rubbery feel to that contact shelf liner, whatever it is. And whichever colors I'm using for a piece, I leave out. I don't put them away in my wood case until I'm completely done. What I'm doing is measuring to make sure where this major shadow needs to start. I knew that it was the same width as the ear, and so I used my pencil to judge that value instead of, I mean, I can grab a ruler and measure to make it exact. I just need it close. So I just figured out the approximate size of the ear on the pencil and then held that up to make sure I knew where that shadow, that major shadow started on the shoulder. If you can check your work against itself like this as you work, it'll make your finished result much more accurate. Because if that shadow is too far up or too far down, it would make a big difference in the actual structure of the wolf. So this whole section needs to be much darker, darkening that up. I'm just better defining areas that need to be darker, which makes my job much easier when I start coming through with a white colored pencil for the individual strands of hair. If my dark area here isn't dark enough, that white really isn't going to show up well. Of course, if I go too dark, then my white will be too dark on top of it. So you've got to find a balance there. And I promise that will come with time and practice. There's so much in art that early on I felt I was never going to understand. I was never going to really get a feel for how to mix this or how to know what to do when. You really do. You don't even realize you're learning it at the time, but it really does start to stick with you. You start to figure stuff out. But that will only come with time and practice. Using a purple tone in between the white and that pink color I have, or reddish brown, whatever. I make them names for colors all the time. It's a terrible habit. So again, here you can see, look how dark that is. This is a white animal, and look how dark I have to go to create his fur. It's pretty obvious up against the glow on the outer edges how dark the inside is. Blending that out with my brush and paint thinner, and I've got a lot of paint thinner on my brush there. I'm being very, very messy. Don't really care about which direction my brush is moving in. I'm just slopping it on there and getting it all smooth. And I'm moving the brush in several directions, little circles and straight lines. I will repeat this process until it's smooth. I find that if I try to get it this smooth and this dark, my first shot with blending with the paint thinner, I still end up with a very grainy look. It takes several layers for me to get it as smooth as I want. So that's why you'll see so often where I blend it out with paint thinner, add more pencil, blend it out with paint thinner, add more pencil. If I just try to add enough pencil the first time through and blend it once with paint thinner, it does not come out right. You can see those white areas really stand out where I had put the white down first. I'm pointing at the screen, but you guys can't see that. I'm a genius. So now when I come through with the white pencil, it really shows up very nicely against the darks that I have on there. Now with this, at this stage, I'm adding a lot of pressure to that white pencil. I need the white pencil to stay very sharp, and I'm adding a lot of pressure. You can tell because of how much my middle finger is bent at an angle because I'm pushing so hard. And I've got to save this towards the last stages because if I do this too early on, I could cause more problems than good. You can see my white is not white white. It's not as white as those outer edges of the fur, but it's still light, which works because this is in shadow. I don't want that to be perfectly white. That pencil is a lot sharper than it looks. If I was using a very dull tipped pencil, my lines would be too thick, so they wouldn't really look like fur. Don't just put random lines anywhere. Follow the direction of that fur. Really watch your reference photo. Like I said earlier, I'm not worried that they're exact, but they need to be close. I do have a real-time clip of this over on Facebook if you want to check that out, of just this section of adding the white over the darks here. Now I'm coming back through with my darks in between some of these clumps of fur. I'm not covering the white that I just did. I'm going in between them to better define my clumps. At this point, that back section that is just solid pink right now on the wolf's shoulder looks like he was shaved. Which I don't recommend trying to do. I hear wolves don't like to be shaved. And this again, with these darker pencils, you've got to watch the direction that your pencil strokes are and how long those strokes are. Now here I'm using the black and I'll come back over with white. I don't want it to be black, but I do need to darken it quite a bit, and it's mostly the inner portions, the most inner portions within the fur of those shadows. So basically up against the lightest portion of the fur and the darkest or the darker area of the shadow, it's where those two meet that I'm putting the darkest blacks. As you're working, if you get to a point where you're thinking it doesn't look good, but you're afraid to mess it up if you have to. You're not going to learn if you don't keep trying to push forward. If something doesn't look just right to you now, there's no reason to leave it that way. It's already not right. So even if you mess something up, it didn't matter. It wasn't right to begin with. So don't be afraid to keep building and keep layering until you get the look that you want. I would much rather see someone mess something up or feel like they messed something up than to have never tried it and not push forward in their art. If you're always afraid to mess things up, you're not going to progress very fast. Be willing to experiment and try things and keep pushing that same piece forward until it gets to where you want it to look. If you're working in paint, I would do this very similar, where I lay down the darker colors first and then put the light colors on top of it. It's easier in paint by a lot because those whites are so opaque. But I like to get my darks in there, which is opposite, because usually I'm telling you to get your lights in first. I still start lighter than I need to go, but if I don't get those darker, that pink kind of brick red color that I've got on there, then these white pencil lines aren't going to show. So right here, a lot of these shadows are harsher than they're going to need to be. I'll end up coming back through with white and going over a lot of this, over both the dark and the light, and it basically softens up the fur and pushes everything closer together. And I apparently walked away from the camera again, and I'm back. Okay, now that I've got the darks in there, I can come back through with a very sharp white luminance pencil and start building up the clumps of fur. Now some of these, where they're softer, I'm being more solid in my fur versus sketchy or leaving those pencil strokes. Like around the back of the neck. That fur is very soft, so I don't have a lot of those individual strokes in there. Now at this point you can see that all of this is really pink way more pink than I want. It actually has a bit more contrast than I want in a lot of these clumps of fur. So here I'm going to come back through, and I don't even remember if I caught this on camera, but I'm going to come back through with that white pencil and basically go over all of this. It's going to soften the fur up a lot and not have so much pink in contrast at this point. So blending out what I have here with paint thinner. But when I back away from the piece, at this point I was really able to see that my attention was drawn to the neck instead of the face. I want the mouth, the nose, the eye, that area to really be my focus. And here I've got so much of this pink, it wasn't. So I've got to come back through with a lot of white. I'm even using, I think that's a titanium buff color with the Luminance here for some of this. But I need to soften up my contrast. As much as I like contrast, if the contrast is pulling attention away from where I want my focus, I've got to soften it up. And this is where your being an artist comes into play. You're not a photographer, so you don't need your photo or your picture to be exactly to the photo if that photo isn't pulling attention where you want it. As the artist, you need to come back through and decide where you want the viewer's attention to go. And you can control that with your contrast. So here that white is going over a lot more. So what I'm doing with that brown tone right there is pulling out some of the darks so that they're not just dark, dark spots. I want them to fade out, which will help your attention not to be focused on those spots. I'm just loosely putting that brown over that whole area to darken it up. Not worrying about my brush strokes because I'm using such a light hand and I'm going to blend it out with the paint thinner. I'm just essentially the same as I would do a glaze on a painting. I'm just tinting the color. Same thing here. I want that shadow better defined just there, and I'm going over the lights and the darks. Pulling those darks up into the face as well so that they move together better. Right now, you can't really see the face, but I've got more of a cool gray up there, and I need to pull some of these browns up into the face so that it all blends together nicely. I don't want only cool gray on the face and warm browns and grays on the neck. It won't look like they're both a part of the same animal. So I'm just going to blend that out with paint thinner, and by going over everything like this, again, I'm just softening that fur out even more, in addition to tinting the color. I'm basically smudging my lines just a bit by doing this. I've got a lot of paint thinner on that brush here. It's funny, until I started explaining it to you guys, I didn't realize that there was so much variation in how much paint thinner I use on my brush in wildlife versus portraits. I'm using that titanium buff again. And here's where I start coming through with the white and just softening everything up. I have got to break up the contrast so that I'm not focusing just on the neck of the wolf. And I believe I added even more white after I stopped filming because I backed away from it and decided I still needed to tone it down quite a bit. But that was essentially just going over what I had finished and blending it out with paint thinner. It didn't take a lot of extra work. Well, and that is it for our first of now having a new voiceover every single week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If not, you can mute me. Yay for the mute button.